Welcome to session number 16 of an introduction to worldviews and apologetics. I'm Dr. John McMath, and I'm joined here today by my friends in Italy and the Philippines. And we've been studying together for a couple of years now. They're under COVID lockdowns and all kinds of badness that makes travel difficult. But we have this connection. Today we'll be looking at the last chapter that I'm going to do from the book Faith Has Its Reasons. And today we're going to be looking at the fifth of the apologetic methods. We've looked at classical apologetics, which is the very old method, goes all the way back to New Testament times. We've looked at evidentialism, which is a more modern method built on the accumulation of facts from history and archaeology and science and whatnot. We've looked at the Reformed tradition, which is almost an anti-apologetic, which says in order to understand anything at all about the whole world, you've got to presuppose Christianity. Otherwise, nothing makes sense. And we've looked at fideism, which says only believe. The instantaneous experience of faith in God trumps all other expectations, and it proves everything. Each of the approaches has its strengths and its weaknesses, and we've looked at those. Each of these approaches has its staunch defenders. There are those like Norm Geisler, for instance, in the modern world, is a very brilliant guy who is a classical apologist. And he's convinced that there's only the one way to do this. There are people like Josh McDowell, who are evidentialists, and they will argue that there's only the one way to do this job. The same is true with the Reformed tradition and with the fideist position. Even in the modern world, there are mostly academics and professional scholars who focus on one. There are also a school of apologists, if you can call it a school, who argue that there's some good in every approach, and the best approach combines several of the traditional approaches. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. We call this integration, putting together several different approaches, or combinationalism. And I don't like either of those terms, but you've got to have a title for the first slide. So we're going to call it combinationalism, and I'm going to go over to that screen now. Let's see if we can get the PowerPoint started. Okay, and share the screen. Bingo. And there it is. Okay. This particular cartoon is from an old comic strip. I don't think it's still published anywhere, but we call this The Far Side by Gary Larson. So here's a fella out in the woods of North Idaho. This is a picture that I can understand very well today. It says snowmen for sale, some assembly required. And you take a big pile of snow and you assemble the parts, and eventually you can have your own snowman. Okay. The apologists who favor combinationalism tend to pick and choose. There are approaches and situations where the classical approach works well, particularly when added together with a short stack of evidences. Uh, a reformed apologist may use a classical proof if he decides that that will help in a conversation that he's having. Really, the bottom line for practical apologetics, when we're doing evangelism, anything that helps to answer questions and move the process along is a good method. If somebody will respond to the ontological argument, more power to them. I'm happy to provide an ontological argument. If that doesn't click, then I'll try some evidences, or I'll try a fideist approach. What have you got to lose? Why not try Christ? I, whatever works is what I want to use when I'm doing evangelism. When I'm teaching young believers, high school and college age particularly, anything that keeps their attention and adds to their confidence in the gospel is a good method. So I've found with college kids, particularly, cosmological and teleological arguments from the classical period really click with them. They like that. It sounds very erudite and very rational. And it is. I mean, they're good rational arguments, and young people need to know that the things that they've believed since they were children are in fact rational and provable and logical. So it works. But they also enjoy science and history and archaeology and all kinds of other stuff. The evidentialist approach often works. I rarely use a reformed approach with my teaching, even though that is the position that I hold theologically. I find that it doesn't provide me a lot of tools when I'm trying to either do evangelism or trying to strengthen believers. But I do make the basic presupposition that man's sin has so darkened his eyes that he can't see the truth when it's directly in front of him, that it requires an act of God to do this thing. So I'm a reformed apologist who often uses classical and evidential methods with an underlying flavor of fideism. That's basically where I am. And at the end of the day, if what I do works for people, then it was a good method. Now, there are some actual working apologists who publish books about it, who've made a point of combining a variety of different methods. They make a point that no one approach is always helpful. A multi-pronged approach is more likely to succeed. And so here you've got 4 different approaches that are possible with lots of elements in each one, some assembly required. You're going to put it together to form the package that works where you are. So there have been several famous apologists in the modern period since the 19th century who've made a point of combining a variety of approaches. And we're going to start with somebody really fairly recent, only died, 50 years ago. This is Edward John Carnell, taught at Westminster Seminary in the US. Because he teaches or taught at Westminster, we would expect that he would have a reformed bent to his approach. He, of course, was a student of Cornelius Van Til, who was at Princeton before the split. Cornelius Van Til is the classic presuppositionalist. He's the man, and he's said most everything that needs saying. And Carnell inherited the Reformed presuppositionalism that until the existence of God and the activity of God in the world is presupposed, nothing else at all makes any sense. And I believe that as well. But Carnell does it in a different way. His starting point is definitely the existence of the triune God of the Bible, but his method was not a pure presuppositionalism. He took the existence of God as a hypothesis to be tested, and the test of the presupposition is actually rather complex, and it traces back to his background as an academic. So he speaks of the test of non-contradiction, which is very much the classical approach. And this was from his time at Wheaton University, the seminary part of that, and Norm Geisler taught there. This is classical apologetics, the test of non-contradiction. He also worked under Gordon Clark doing his master's thesis. And from them, he got this very classical approach. But he also says that there is a test of fitness to empirical fact. Okay, if there is a God, then the facts on the ground ought to bear that out. So we're going to test the hypothesis by looking for evidence in the world that there is a God, evidence of the creation, evidence of providence, evidence from history, the existence of the church, the resurrection. Well, this sounds very much like an evidentialist. Yeah, that's exactly right. Carnell did his PhD work at Boston University, and he sat under the very prominent evidentialist Edgar Brightman, who was his PhD advisor. So he's got evidentialism in here. And he also did research at Harvard into the work of Kierkegaard and Niebuhr. And from this, he gets the third test, the test of relevance to personal experience. Relevance to personal experience. He's combining classic, evidential, fideist, and reformed views, all in one character. Carnell has been very influential in the development of reformed apologetics, and really a combinational apologetics, by producing this test. His several books. I've done an introduction to Christian apologetics, which is one of the classics. That's one of those books that most pastors in America have on their shelf. Most of us haven't read it recently, but just about everybody has a copy of that. He's the man. Carnell argues often enough that the law of non-contradiction is basic, since its denial makes all other knowledge impossible. If you deny the law of non-contradiction, then there's nothing there. Nothing can ever be known for sure about anything. which is the point of postmodernism. The modern relativist idea that nothing can ever be known for sure. You can't know whether you're a man or a woman, for example. You can't know whether murder is right or wrong. You can't know whether theft is right or wrong. Yet nothing can ever be known for sure because the law of non-contradiction is invalid under the postmodernist mindset. This explains the failure of a lot of modern politics. We in America are suffering through the biennial election season. It's amazing that there's such a division among people. But if you've got half the population who believe that there is no truth and nothing can ever be known for sure, then you're going to get a division in the political outcomes, just the way it goes. So Carnell would say that the law of non-contradiction is basic, and of course I agree to him. This is basic to most classic apologetics, but Carnell also argues that arguments for God are impossible. And he makes the important note that the Bible produces no such syllogisms. You're not going to find a 7-point argument for the existence of God in the first chapter of Genesis. The Bible begins, in the beginning, God. You either accept that or you don't. But God doesn't produce an argument for himself. He simply presents himself. That's Reformed apologetics. Carnell also dismisses Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas produced 5 proofs for the existence of God. And Carnell says they actually reduce to empirical arguments. I'm not sure he's right on that, but that's what Carnell says. And these empirical arguments, an empirical argument, an argument from evidence, can never produce proof. It can only produce probability. Carnell is actually a little more sympathetic to the evidentialist viewpoint than he lays out. He tries to steer a middle path between classic proofs and evidentialism by what he calls the test of systematic consistency. This involves an eternal lack of contradiction, which is the classical argument, with an external agreement with all the facts of one's experience, which includes both evidentialism and fideism. So he puts it all together. We look at everything in all of experience, everything I've read, everything I see in the world around me, everything I can test historically or scientifically. And if everything is explainable, then I have systematic consistency. And if my position is non-contradictory, then it's very likely that I've got a true position. So that's what Carnell ultimately is doing. Kind of fun. But we're really not through yet because Carnell is also a Reformed apologist. In his first and most influential book that I mentioned, The Introduction to Christian Apologetics, Carnell argues that the Christian hypothesis is not just one hypothesis among many. It is the ultimate hypothesis. That is, what the Christian says is an assumption that must be made in order to have a proper understanding of reality. Okay, well, that sounds like the classic or the Reformed position right at the base of it. Carnell also recognizes the problem of circular reasoning. The Bible is inerrant, and the Bible says that the Bible is inerrant. And because the Bible is inerrant, everything the Bible says must be true, and the Bible says that the Bible is inerrant. That's a circular argument. And Carnell, there are several circular arguments like that. Carnell says that there's a certain amount of circular reasoning that's ultimately inevitable in Christianity. I disagree with him on that. And next week, we're going to begin asking some questions, and we will get into some of those. The bottom line here is that sin has so tarnished human reason that God needs to reveal himself. The believer is confronted with the living God and submits in faith. Afterwards, in retrospect, he may test his hypothesis by the processes of systematic consistency to discover that, in fact, the Christian worldview does account for truth, for ethics, for beauty, for the human self, and for the natural world. Carnell would never suggest that non-Christians should apply systematic consistency from their viewpoint to discover if Christianity is true. So Carnell is covering himself from every direction, but he does make the very he makes the tactical position that that the assumption of the ultimate hypothesis is a gift of God. God gives that faith. And then afterwards, we can see that it is both reasonable and consistent with the evidence. But until we have trusted Christ, we'll never see it. So the Christian hypothesis is the ultimate hypothesis. But that's not the way we approach non-Christians, if that makes any sense at all. Okay, let's go on to a little more of Carnell. This happens because Carnell spent a lot of his energy, particularly at Harvard, doing a project of critiquing Kierkegaard. Now, you remember Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, mathematician, was the founder of both secular and religious existentialism. Existentialism is very hard to pin down, and deliberately so, I think. But existentialism suggests that the only reality is the subjective experience that I am having in this moment. As I exist, this is my truth, and there is nothing else. Carnell, in his critique of Kierkegaard, says, among other things, this, and agreeing with Kierkegaard: if Christianity is not the truth, the alternative is a miserable dialectic of despair, which sounds really fun. And it's actually really truth. When we look at the modern world as it has rejected Christ, we see a confused melange of miserable people, despairing people. There is no meaning in their lives apart from what they invent. And that's what's left if Christianity is not true. And the fundamental paradox is that no proof of Christianity is possible until the trust has been committed. Until you've actually believed in Christ, you will never know that Christianity is in fact true. So at least this is fun. He took this to mean that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Those are his words. If you want to know whether or not that pudding or that lasagna that you've just made is any good, you've got to take a taste. Otherwise, you'll never know. You never know. You must trust Christ in order to discover that Christ is ultimately trustworthy. And no proof is possible until the trust has been committed. But Carnell would never allow himself to be pigeonholed. Something I appreciate about him, and I say I haven't read through Carnell recently, but I lie. I've got the book right here, and I've looked through several chapters recently. I like his approach. Carnell would say there is no official approach to apologetics. And that's the mantra of the combinationalist. At least I've never found one. The approach is governed by the climate of the times. That means, as it were, the apologist must play it by ear. There's no music to follow. We've got to wade in and find the approach that works with the people we're working with. Very important observation, and Carnell is right. I'm going to go on to the apologist who has pretty much transformed the 20th century approach to apologetics. This is Francis Schaeffer. He's an American, but with Swiss and German backgrounds. And he was a missionary to Switzerland from shortly after World War II until his death in 1984. Francis Schaeffer is one of the most beloved Christian apologists of the 20th century. His influence was so great that Newsweek magazine, a distinctively left-wing, liberal, secular, non-Christian magazine, called him the guru of fundamentalism. And truly he is. He's a great man and much missed. I was alive and kicking and in the early parts of my ministry while Francis Schaeffer was in his climax of life. And I remember well, listening to him and reading his books. So I don't have all of Francis Schaeffer's books anymore. I lost those in a fire 40 years ago, but I've read all of his books, and Francis Schaeffer is one of the great ones. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Francis Schaeffer really embodied the ideal of an apologist who spoke the truth in love. He's an apologist who didn't like to be diverted from the task of evangelist. He loved leading people to Christ. For many years, he managed a retreat center in Switzerland, not too far from Lucerne, where he welcomed everyone. Listened to their questions, talked about answers, had conversations with people. This is a shot from the region of La Brie. La Brie is a French word that means the shelter. And it was a kind of a guest house, a rustic camp out, summer camp sort of a place where people could just come for a retreat. And there were very few rules and not a whole lot of program. He would sometimes invite guest speakers. Sometimes he was the major speaker. Sometimes there were no speakers. There was just community and conversation. It's a very, it's an open-ended ministry. And he's a very interesting guy. I'm going to give you some quotations from Schaeffer. This is one I really like. All men bear the image of God. They have value not because they are redeemed, but because they are God's creation in God's image. That is so important for us to recognize. Sometimes I am very irritated with the non-Christian world, but I have to remember that these people around us are valuable, not because they are Christians, because they're not, but because they are God's creation. They're created in God's image. And I ought to respect everyone, even those with whom I vehemently disagree. Schaeffer did that. Schaeffer inspired evangelical Christians to expand their approach. The expanded approach is really what makes Francis Schaeffer a combinationalist. Now listen to this quote. Let's think about it for a second. If Christianity is really true, then it involves the whole man, including his intellect and creativeness. Christianity is not just dogmatically true or doctrinally true. Rather, it is true to what is there, true in the whole area of the whole man in all of life. Okay, this is true in the marketplace. This is true in culture. This is true in the music I listen to, and in the art that I enjoy, and in the hobbies I pursue. Christianity, if it is true in all of life and in all of what surrounds us. It is really true. So Schaeffer looked at apologetics not merely in the philosophical or in the scientific or the historical. He did it all. He said that the traditional routes of philosophy, theology, science, history are not enough. Look also at ethics. Look at the arts. He called what he did cultural apologetics. And it's a fascinating thing. It's interesting to see the relationship of theological error, for example, on the culture. What does the rejection of God do to popular music? What does the rejection of the resurrection of Christ do to the development of art? You know, until I read Francis Schaeffer, I never thought about those things. I'd never thought it important. I'd actually never studied history of art or history of music, but Francis Schaeffer did, and he showed the relationship between a Christian culture and a Christian worldview and the art and music and literature that is produced by that compared to the non-Christian worldview. And he demonstrates very logically that a Christian worldview produces a culture that is very attractive, that is quite livable. So let's think about Francis Schaeffer. I'll tell you a little bit about his life. He grew up in a liberal Presbyterian family in Philadelphia, and I don't see Oscar on board quite yet, but Oscar has been in Philadelphia. I hope everything is going well there. But yeah, back in the day, early part of the 20th century, that's where he grew up. But he read his Bible. He came to Christ as a boy, which can be done even in a liberal Presbyterian church. The truth has a way of finding you. In college, he began doing Bible studies in a nearby African American church because it was available. Something I've told young people, my college students. When a ministry opportunity presents itself, always say yes if there's any possible way you can do it, because you never know. You don't know what God is up to. This African American church experience in America is quite different from what white people experience. And Francis Schaeffer just waded right in, and he learned how to sing with them, and he learned how to pray with them, and he learned how to do Bible studies with them, because they're God's children, they're God's people, and they're expressing their faith in Christ in a really different way, but it's equally valid. And he learned how to do it there. He came back to his home church after some time away while he was finishing up college, and he heard a guest speaker who was in this liberal Presbyterian church trashing the Bible. And so Francis Schaeffer rose to defend the Bible, and he was being argumentative. And there was another person in the group, a young lady, who also stood up to defend the Bible. This young lady, whose name was Edith, later became Francis' wife. And so we have Francis and Edith Schaeffer, who together went off to Switzerland in 1948 and started a ministry called L'Abri. This turned into a world famous place where young people could go and ask their questions and get love and good conversation. It sounds very down to earth, doesn't it? Just like folks, just friends. And that's exactly what they were. That's exactly what they were. We've got a couple of books. Francis Schaeffer wrote a lot of stuff, and he did video as well. There's two books in particular that are, I think, key to understanding Francis Schaeffer. He is there and he is not silent. And how should we then live? He started writing and speaking in the US and in Europe in the 50s. In his first books, Escape from Reason, The God Who Is There, and He Is There and He Is Not Silent, were finished by about 1972. And he considered those books a trilogy. He Is There and He Is Not Silent sums up Schaeffer's basic message. That one, there really is a God. He is there. When we look at the universe, at the earth itself, at the nature of man, at ethics and at culture, it is obvious there is a God who is beyond the universe. He is obviously there. And this combines a classical and an evidentialist approach. But the proof is he is really there. It is logically impossible for there not to be a supreme being. And he is obviously there. And he goes on to say, he is not silent. And that's the point, that God actively intervenes in the life of the world. He has not absconded, as the deist would say. He is not an utterly other being of somebody, a universal force field or something. He is an interactive, personal God. And those two elements, of course, are at the core of the Christian message. God is, and he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And the two go always together. In the beginning phrases of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy, and God said, I am the Lord your God. Okay, Yahweh, the God who exists. I am that I am. I am the Lord your God. who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God not only is, he is active in life. So that's a very, very important book. And that one book really summarizes a great deal of Schaeffer's approach to apologetics. How Should We Then Live is a unique book. This was published in 1976, and he considered this his masterwork. In How Should We Then Live, Schaeffer analyzes the rise and decline of Western thought and culture. This is actually, obviously, huge. There's a great deal going on here. What he's thinking of here is the influence of Christianity on Western culture, and how that influence expanded and gave birth to the greatest culture the world has ever known, and how the loss of that Christian focus has produced the ongoing decline of Western culture. And he demonstrates that through art, music, literature, philosophy, history, current events. It's a masterful study and well worth our reading. So Schaeffer's apologetics retains some elements of the classical apologetics. There's a very, very important question that every Christian needs to ask sooner or later during his lifetime. It goes this way. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, is the one who said it. The basic philosophical question is, why is there something rather than nothing at all? Okay, let's think about that. There could be nothing at all, but there's not. There is something. If there is something, there must be a cause, right? And if there is a cause, what is that cause? The answers that are given to that define the underlying cultural worldview. Schaeffer's quote, I think, is appropriate here. Modern man has not only thrown away Christian theology, he has thrown away the possibility of what our forefathers had as a basis for morality and law. It's gone. Without Christian theology, the basis of Western civilization is simply gone. Modern people realistically are lost in two senses. The people who surround us. In Italy and the Philippines, here in America, the people who surround us are lost in two senses. Evangelically, they're lost because they're sinners without Christ. But they are also lost in the modern sense that their lives have no meaning. This lostness is answered by the existence of a creator. So Christianity does not begin with accept Christ as Savior, but rather with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We begin by answering the question, why is there something rather than nothing at all? And the answer is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's where we begin. And once you lose that, the rest is downhill. This is essentially a cosmological argument. Schaeffer, who had a good Reformed background, also used classical methods, but he also uses evidential methods, and it's going to go there. Schaeffer argues that there are four possibilities to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing at all? One, everything began with an absolute nothing. Absolutely nothing. No God, no earth, no heavens, no matter, no energy, no nothing. Okay. 2, everything began with an impersonal something. There has to have been something there because nothing comes from nothing. It had to begin with something. So let's start with an impersonal something. This would be an answer like pantheism. So the material universe is the eternal something. 3rd, everything began with a personal something. In other words, before the material universe was created, there was a personal God, a supreme being who existed eternally. And 4th, there has always been a dualism. There's always been a spiritual and a material universal duality. The first answer is rare because even non-Christians recognize that nothing comes from nothing. It is logically impossible to say that the universe began with nothing at all. There has to have been something there. The 4th view, the dualism view, is really not an option. It reduces to either an impersonal or a personal something, view 2 or 3. View number 2 is pantheism. This is Eastern mysticism. View number 3 is the Christian position. And those are the only 4 logical possibilities. So you really come down to either an impersonal something or a personal something. And the non-Christian world, for the most part, has taken up the impersonal something. The universe is the supreme being. And they don't typically say that the universe is God, but that's what you're left with. The universe is the supreme God. Evidentialism. Oh, the classical model clearly doesn't dominate Schaeffer's method. Most of his work, he also presents a kind of empirical verificationalism, which is a kind of evidentialism. I like what he does because I find that it's interesting to students. Yeah, this quote is good, but I'm going to give you something else. His approach is not like John Warwick Montgomery or Josh McDowell, the other inductive evidentialists who simply collect bits of evidence to demonstrate the probability of the Christian case. Instead, Schaeffer's program can be compared to the scientific method. He begins with a set of possible hypotheses. Either there is a personal God who created, or the universe arose spontaneously from impersonal, pre-existing matter. And those are basically the 2 approaches. And then he looks at the available evidence and arrives at a verification of the most likely hypothesis. So Francis Schaeffer is actually combining a lot of different approaches. He's taking the evidence, not the way a lawyer would in a courtroom, but the way a scientist would in the laboratory. He's looking at the evidence, suggesting a hypothesis that can explain what he's seeing, and then testing that hypothesis experimentally. Let's see if this hypothesis works. Let's see what kind of culture is produced when people believe that there is a personal God who created the heavens and the earth. Let's see what that does to culture. And then he demonstrates that historically. I love it. Yeah. It's called a verification method. And a successful hypothesis, according to Francis Schaeffer, must meet the same rules as a scientific study or a historical study. It's one, got to be self-consistent and non-contradictory, just like we saw with Carnell. Self-consistent, non-contradictory. It needs to make sense in a deductive way. It also must be inductively true. It must be possible to live with the results. And this has got to meet the same rules as a scientific study. So Schaeffer famously invites skeptics to examine the Christian worldview in the light of every kind of phenomena, including nature, history, human nature, culture, ethics, confident that Christianity will be proven consistent with the facts and conducive to a satisfying life. He knows that that's true because he's lived it himself. And that's what he shares with his readers. So there's a lot of Reformed background to Schaeffer. He was a student of Cornelius Van Til. He's commonly identified as a presuppositionalist by the classical and evidential apologists, but Schaeffer doesn't call himself presuppositional, even though he does make some presuppositions. And even though many of his views fit the method, in a casual conversation, Schaeffer said this: "You're trying to press me into categories of a theological apologist, which I'm not. I'm not an academic scholastic apologist. My interest is in evangelism." He was very clear on that. His point is that he was willing to blend, mix, and match any methods that he could find to discover what was effective in his own environment. For Francis Schaeffer, the right way to do apologetics was the way that happened to work in the conversation he was in. Frankly, this is what I have always liked about Francis Schaeffer. He won't be pushed into a mold and he won't limit himself. He'll do whatever works. I've always liked that. Okay, how reformed is Francis Schaeffer? Well, this takes us all the way back to the beginning of apologetics. It matters whether our focus is reaching non-Christians or strengthening Christians. Schaeffer demonstrates a reformed view in his insistence that only the presupposition of God and salvation makes sense of the world. Still, he was always willing to bend the rules to reach a questioning pilgrim. So is he reformed? Yes, of course he is. Is he an evidentialist? Well, yes. Does he use classical methods? Well, sure. How about fideism? What does he have to say about that? There's a lot of stuff. He talks about the practical application of everything. I believe that pluralistic secularism in the long run is a more deadly poison than straightforward persecution. He's basically saying, if you give me a choice between the modern secularists and, say, the Nazis, give me the Nazis every time. At least I know where they're coming from. They're just going to kill us, and then we go to heaven. This pluralistic secularism makes pagans out of our children. And in the long run, it's a more deadly poison. A very, very evil thing. Schaeffer was mostly critical of both Kierkegaard and Barth, particularly the existential leap of faith. He argued that this had laid a framework for a modern irrationalist culture, which I agree with. Nevertheless, he found both writers often helpful. I felt that neither would be happy with the direction their existentialism has gone. And I think that's true. I think both Kierkegaard and Barth went too far with their positions, and their followers have taken this to extremes, which have not been helpful. But the idea that our current experience, the actual living of life, is the proof of the truth of our underlying presuppositions, is I think that goes without saying, and Schaeffer would agree with that. I think the fideist tendency in Schaeffer is his insistence that no non-Christian can be consistent with his non-Christian presuppositions. It's an interesting line. You just can't live this life. So if every one of us was to agree that the transvestites are the best way to live, if everybody were to pretend to be the opposite sex, life would be chaotic. Culture would collapse. There's absolutely no future in this kind of silliness. The non-Christian worldview simply doesn't work. They simply don't work in the real world. And in this is found a point of tension. That's Schaeffer's line. When we discover in the non-Christian his point of tension, where his worldview is inconsistent with the life he's trying to live, at that point, we have the opportunity to invite him to trust the God who is there, the God who is not silent. Schaeffer wouldn't call this a leap of faith and says that the terminology is useful only because the culture has deteriorated, but he still sounds to me an awful lot like Pascal. Your worldview has failed. Take a leap into the light, but a leap still. Some random quotes from Schaeffer are going to carry this. Our relationship with each other is the criterion the world uses to judge whether our message is truthful. Christian community is the final apologetic. When we think through what happens in our churches, our church splits, our arguments over points of theology, our arguments over really, truly stupid things. What kind of apologetic are we? So Francis Schaeffer is absolutely true. The world judges us by our own hypocrisy. And our best apologetic would be a solid Christian community that works. I take that as a critique. The Christian should be the person who is alive, whose imagination absolutely boils, which moves, which produces something a bit different from God's world, because God made us to be creative. When we fall into habitual patterns that become perhaps the traditional way of doing things, we're often no longer being creative. We've stopped thinking, we've stopped creating, and we mustn't do that. We must remember throughout our lives that in God's sight there are no little people and no little places. Only one thing is important: to be consecrated persons in God's place for us at each moment. I like that. That's very much a fideist existentialist way of thinking. This is something that I think Schaeffer got from Kierkegaard, and he's right. Wherever we are and whoever we are, God has put us in this place, and we belong to Him. So let's be consecrated to what God has given us here and now. Now let's talk about raising children. One of the greatest injustices we can do to our young people is to ask them to be conservative. Christianity is not conservative, but revolutionary. The point of Christianity is to ask the world to make a radical transformation. That's revolutionary. That's not conservative at all. Culturally, yes, I think there's a place for conservatism, and I consider myself conservative. But the idea that we must conserve the past at all costs is wrong. We should be creative. Christianity is not conservative, it is revolutionary. I think about that and I wonder. Um, Here's another one of my favorite things. Truth carries with it confrontation. Truth demands confrontation. Loving confrontation, but confrontation nevertheless. Uh, if we have the truth, we must confront the world with it. Look at that. Humanism is the idea that man is the measure of all things. There is no higher power. There is no God, sometimes called naturalism or secularism. Humanism is not wrong in its cry for sociological healing, but humanism is not producing it. there's the practicality of Francis Schaeffer. Uh, the, the secular humanists are crying, we want equality and freedom and liberty and so on. Yes, but your secular humanistic approach is not producing that outcome. Doing the same thing over and over again without result is the definition of insanity. Humanism isn't working. I like his thinking. He's thought about education. Today, we have a weakness in our education process in failing to understand the natural associations between the disciplines, okay, like theology and mathematics. We think that they can exist on unrelated parallel lines. And this tends to be true both Christian and secular education. As one of the reasons why evangelical Christians have been taken by surprise at the tremendous shift that has come in our generation. We didn't see it coming because we're over here doing theology while they're over here doing mathematics and science and philosophy. And we just let them do that. And as they do that, they're undermining the Christian presuppositions in the secular world. Okay, we've got some other apologists out there. I'm going to mention them quickly. Since Schaeffer, combinationalism has become the common thread of evangelical apologetics. Academic scholars tend to emphasize one or the other, but working pastors, people making disciples, evangelists tend to use the methods that work at the moment. And there's some apologists I'm going to mention quickly because they're worth looking at. I'm not even going to show you pictures of these guys, but they're important. David Clark is fascinating. He was an evangelical raised in Japan and learned from childhood Eastern philosophy, the pantheistic Shinto of Japan, the Buddhism of China, and other related Eastern philosophies. And his apologetics is called dialogical apologetics. It's a very much a person-centered apologetic designed to respond to the type of faith an individual is most likely to develop. He studied at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School outside of Chicago, studied under Norm Geisler for a while. He wrote about the pantheism of Alan Watts. He's an expert in Eastern pantheism. With Norm Geisler, he wrote Apologetics in the New Age. The New Age is the Western world's version of pantheism. And, Clark's approach is fresh, it's interesting, and is very much combinational. He'll do whatever it takes to reach Buddhists and Hindus for Christ. Very interesting guy. I've read just a little of his work because I haven't had a lot of contact with Buddhists and Hindus, but there's a lot of people out there, and we're going to run into them. Okay, Stephen Evans about my age, born in 1949, same year as me, is a Christian philosopher, devoted his career to the study of Kierkegaard. And he's basically an evidentialist, but with an emphasis on natural theology, which is interesting. His point is that the evidence of the natural world is not proof of God, but ought to make the atheist uncomfortable with his system. The non-Christian should be confronted with enough evidence that he is forced to face his points of tension. The non-Christian worldview cannot satisfactorily explain the real world. So eventually, the non-Christian can be invited to take the risk of trusting God to discover that, in fact, everything makes sense. So a combination of evidentialism and fideism. And he's a fascinating guy. And his Kierkegaard studies just add a kind of a Danish accent to everything that he does. I've read some articles by Stephen Evans. He's a fascinating character approaching the end of his career. John Frame is now retired for quite a while. He's a student of Van Til, definitely presuppositionalist. But he's offered an interpretation of presuppositionalism that allows for a broad use of all kinds of other methods. Again, I've read articles by John Frame, and I see him quoted often. His teaching combines a lot of evidentialism with a classical approach. He's a student of Van Til, so he's obviously a reformed apologist, but he combines it all and allows a broad use of all kinds of methods. So what are we really saying? Combinationalism is really the dominant approach to apologetics that we're going to see in the modern world. The academics will continue to emphasize one approach or another, but for those of us out in the trenches, actually confronting the non-Christian world, whatever works is a good thing. For me, the patron saint of combinationalism is obviously Francis Schaeffer. I can put a copy of Schaeffer's book in the hands of students, and they immediately take to him. They can follow. He is there, and he is not silent. As an argument for the existence of God, I think is without peer. It just does the job. And of course, how should we then live? If these things are true, what should life look like? It's a marvelous confrontation of the modern world with the failure to follow a Christian worldview. So let me end the slide, and I'm going to unmute everybody. There we go. All right. Folks, next week, we're going to move on from this kind of academic thing to attempt to answer some questions that non-Christians ask. The title of let's see if I can make this go. There it is. The title of this whole series I've called "Know Why You Believe," and this is a little book that we're going to begin working through next week, with additions from some other stuff here in my library. Know Why You Believe by Paul Little. It's a series of questions that the non-Christian world regularly asks, and we'll think through whether or not there is a Christian answer. And you perhaps have been asked some of these questions. I know you have, and you're going to be interested to see that there are answers. to virtually all of these questions. And I'll be using a combinationalist approach. You know that I'm Reformed, that I like the classical stuff. I enjoy evidentialism, and I believe that fideism has some answers. So you're going to see how that works in answering the kinds of questions that non-Christians really ask. So we'll see you again next week. God bless everybody. I hope that you enjoy your community right where you are. Blessings now. We'll see you next time around. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Don. Bye-bye, Joel. Mark, see ya. Yeah, hey, PJ.
Dr. John.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Joel.
Ciao a tutti.
Brother John. Okay.
Bye-bye, Dr. John.
Where is everything here? Bye-bye, guys.